Welcome to another episode of Things You Didn't Know About the Holocaust. I'm Phyllis Zimbler Miller, and I'm very pleased today to have as my guest someone actually calling in from The Hague. He is Timothy W. Ryback. He's an historian and the director of the Institute for Historical Justice and Reconciliation. He's also the author of several books on Germany, the most recent, Takeover, Hitler's Rise to Final Rise to Power. But here's what we're going to be talking about today. On January 8th, 2025, so a couple of weeks ago, the Atlantic magazine published an article of his that caught my eye, really caught my eye. It's called How Hitler Dismantled a Democracy in 53 Days, and the subtitle is He Used the Constitution to Shatter the Constitution. And that really caught my eye. Of course, I've read the article. I took notes. You would think I was in college, and I'm so excited to talk to Tim about it. So, why don't you start where you'd like our audience to know what's going on?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for having me, Phyllis, to talk about this. Yeah, the article is sort of what it says it is, which is it was 92 years ago this month that Adolf Hitler was appointed chancellor, and this was on January 30th, so at the end of this month. And
1933.
1933, and within 53 days had successfully disabled and then dismantled a constitutional republic completely through legal constitutional means. I'm not a constitutional historian or lawyer, but I believe it's one of the few cases where an authoritarian or a dictatorial regime has come to power completely through legal means. And I think the most important part of the lesson to be learned here was that, Hitler abided within broad parameters by the law, but basically used democracy to destroy democracy.
Let's just wind back just for people who might not know this. So at the end of, and the historian will correct me, the end of World War I, when Germany signed an armistice, the Kaiser abdicated. And then a republic, the first republic in Germany called the Weimar, Weimar Republic, was established. So now we are coming up on 13, 14, 15 years later, and this is the republic, the constitutional republic that Hitler destroyed in 53 days. So what happened? And also the people should know that Hitler was legally given the job of chancellor. And then what happened?
Yeah. Well, what actually happened was Hitler, I think famously everyone's heard of the beer hall putsch in 1923, November of 1923, attempted a violent overthrow of the government. And it failed within hours. I mean, it was a complete chaos, just a disaster. Hitler ended up being placed on trial, and then for treason, what ended up going to prison. He was given a 5-year prison sentence, but because of good behavior and a fairly lax legal system, sympathetic legal system, was released within 9 months. Um, but he was, sorry, yeah, Phyllis.
And during that time, he wrote the first draft of Mein Kampf, in which he said what he was going to do.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, he called his time in Landsberg prison, he called it my higher education at state expense because he spent all of his time reading books and writing his autobiography, this political biography called Mein Kampf, in which he basically outlined everything that he ended up implementing. But to go back to it, so he was imprisoned. He served time. He was released on good behavior because of lax judges, but also on the promise that he would not attempt to overthrow the democratic system through violence. And he had to take what was called a legality oath, which was a vow to abide by the Constitution. He did not, however, relent on his conviction that he wanted to destroy the Weimar democracy. And his point, he ended up in 1930, several years later, 7 years later, appearing in court as a witness before the Constitutional Court, in which he again said he invoked Article 1 of the Constitution, which said the the um, the government is an expression of the will of the people. This is Article 1 of the Weimar Constitution. And Hitler says, so if I come to power through legal means, through democratic process, according to the Constitution, I can shape the government into any form I want, which ultimately was a dictatorship. But he went through this process through a completely legal means. And Phil, so what I might mention here is, it's easy to say, oh, someone wants to be a dictator because they're a dictator, or dictatorial instincts, authoritarian instincts. They don't believe in democracy. Well, it's for Hitler, it was more than a megalomaniacal egotism. He states this in Mein Kampf. He writes about the fact, why does he hate democracy? Why does he hate parliamentarian democracy in particular? And his argument was that you bring together a parliament, um, they can take decisions, including signing the Treaty of Versailles, which, burdens the German people with the war guilt, meaning the complete guilt for everything that happened in the First World War, saddle them on top of that with onerous reparations, billions of gold marks that in repayment to the Allies. And Hitler's point was, and he was against the Treaty of Versailles. That was actually the drum that he beat for the next 13 years and really stoked a lot of resentment with people. But the point was, Hitler said somebody can be elected to a parliament. They can take a decision that can bankrupt a country, that can put it into box it into a political corner, burden it with all kinds of things, but have no personal responsibility because after they've served their term, they leave and they go home, and the country itself is saddled with all the burdens that they have placed. So whether you've driven the country into debt, whether you've, as I say, saddled it with the war guilt clause, there is no personal responsibility. And Hitler's point was that in a dictatorship, there's one person who takes has the complete authority, also takes the responsibility. Now, that maybe gets a little, he fudged that one a bit, but the point was his reason for hating the Weimar Republic, first of all, was because of the Treaty of Versailles, but secondly, there was a deeper logic for why he was against democratic systems in general. And it came back ultimately to the accountability of elected representatives.
So then let's talk about his 53 days. The president of the Weimar Republic, Paul von Hindenburg, chooses the Nazi Party. You want to explain that the Nazi Party was why the chancellor came from the Nazi Party, then why it was Hitler. Let's go over that briefly.
Okay. In a multi-party system like they had in Weimar, unlike in the United States, you have basically a two-party system. You have Democrats, you have Republicans, and whoever gets 51%, gets the whole cake basically. In a parliamentary system, in the Weimar system, you had as many as 32 political parties. So the pie was divided up among a couple of significant parties with a lot of smaller ones. So what one needed in order to reach the 51%, you had to create coalitions. So, the Social Democrats could partner with some left-leaning centrist parties. Right-wing parties could, ally, get together and create their coalition. The Hitler, the National Socialist Workers' Party, which was what we call the Nazi Party, um, in a July 1932 election, they got 37% of the vote, which was the largest political party in the country. The next were the Social Democrats with, probably, 25, 30%, but no one came close to the 37%. Hitler argued, and listen to his calculation on this, 37% was 75% of 51%. So he wanted the claim for complete power, which was a majority, a relative majority of a simple majority, um, gave him claim to complete power. Well, the President Hindenburg, you'd mentioned him, he was the president of the country, which basically served as the king who was he was elected directly by the people. So he was the ultimate representative of the people of the country. But what he did then was to appoint a chancellor to run the government. So the day-to-day running of the country was run by the chancellor. In the United States, we kind of collapsed that into just the executive branch of government. But in the Weimar system, and in England, you have the well, now the King of England, and then you have a prime minister who gets elected, who runs the country. But there's sort of this um,
Person.
person who's sort of representing the nation itself, but the day-to-day business is run by the chancellor or the prime minister. So that was and so Hindenburg appointed Hitler chancellor in January of 1933. Hitler had 37%, but he'd cobbled together a coalition of other conservative parties to give him, a simple majority. Um, but he still had to deal with a parliamentary system. And what Hitler wanted to do was to enact what he called an enabling law, which would basically give him dictatorial power to simply enact laws or do basically function without any other branches of government, basically disabling the balance of power and the checks and balances in the system. Now the problem with that was you required a two-thirds vote in the parliament, in what was called the Reichstag, a 600 seat body, and he needed to get that number in order to get that percentage, two-thirds of it, in order to get this enabling act in place. Now, why did he want this? I mentioned the complications of the system. Well, Hitler understood, as much as he hated democracy, he understood democracy better than, as well as anyone, and had, when he was in opposition, when they were a smaller party, he basically was using this system to gridlock the legislation, to scuttle legislation, to basically paralyze governments and then end up toppling the chancellors, meaning the president would the chancellor couldn't get any work done, couldn't pass legislation because it was being gridlocked in the legislative process. The president then was forced to remove the chancellor and look for a new one, someone who could get to a 51% coalition together in the government. Now, Hitler had spent in opposition his time scuttling these other chancellorships. He wanted to avoid others doing unto him as he had done unto them. And so his first goal in his first cabinet meeting, he put on the table, he said, I want to introduce an enabling act and get this through the Reichstag in order to make good on my campaign promises and prevent others from bringing down my chancellorship.
And so then what happened? And it's a little complicated. I took notes on the side of your article about maybe we'll skip the part about why they had to have elections or didn't have to have elections. But the news is, as those of us who have seen the producers, either as a musical or a movie, the Reichstag burned down.
That's right. And that was sort of um for the Germans, that really was sort of a 9/11 moment for them. I mean, this was the Reichstag was the seat of democracy. It had this glass dome. I mean, they really wanted to embrace the notion of transparency in government, of equality. So, there were about 600 members in the Reichstag in this massive plenary hall with this glass dome. And on the night of February 27th, so Hitler's been in power, well, going on for weeks, um, and is unable to get this two-thirds majority that he wants. Well, there's an arson attack on the Reichstag, and it goes up in flames. Um, the president introduces an emergency decree. Hitler says this was an attack by the communists. It's a threat to the state. We need to suspend civil liberties. And with that, newspapers were banned. The Communist Party was banned. A lot of suppression of various opposition parties and
But
Hitler,
I have a question though. By the way, the
yeah,
Reichstag is in Berlin, in case anyone wants to know.
yeah.
It's a visualize. It's still there today. The building. Uh, did he do this suppression in the Communist Party through the Reichstag or through being chancellor? I mean, powers that the chancellor had. Am I making my question clear?
No,
So, since he hadn't gotten the Enabling Act in place yet, how did he suppress the Communist Party, etc.?
okay, well, what happened was, so he couldn't, through the normal legislative process, get the Enabling Act through. Uh, just pure luck. I'm not luck. I mean, this dramatic incident of the Reichstag burning. The president had the power to enact what was called an emergency
Oh,
decree. It was an article, once again, Constitution provided it was called an Article 48 decree. In times of emergency, the president was able to suspend civil liberties, was able to ban parties. I mean, then you could basically take, in sense, dictatorial action on a short-term basis. So President Hitler said, we need to enact this emergency decree. So a national crisis was declared. And, once again, I think for anyone old enough, if one remembers the trauma in the United States after 9/11, no one knew what was going to happen. No one knew what was coming next. And there was this state of national trauma. You had this with the Reichstag. Hitler exploited this, you know, convinced Hindenburg to introduce the emergency decree, and with that, they blamed the communists for burning the Reichstag, which meant that the Communist Party was suspended, which meant that those number of delegates that they had were no longer represented. So it shifted the balance, and suddenly Hitler was able to browbeat and coerce enough of the other parties into giving him the two-thirds majority in order to enact this enabling act, which was supposed to only be for 4 years. But as we know, it basically established Hitler as a dictator and, was never, was never revoked.
And what was the reaction? I mean, did the media outside Germany think this was really dangerous to allow Germany to do what they to allow Communist Party and have this dictatorial 4 year, even for 4 years structure?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing was when there's a wonderful New York Times headline that when Hitler had said from the very beginning he wanted to be dictator and he would only enter the chancellorship if he were given dictatorial powers. But his party was actually in trouble. He was bankrupt. He was losing members by December of 32. So what happened was when he was offered the chancellorship, he compromised on a lot of the initial demands that he had. And there's a New York Times headline when Hitler's appointment as chancellor was announced. New York Times headline says Hitler, I think, relinquishes demand to be dictator. So it was seen as, oh, Hitler had given up these dictatorial demands and was actually being forced into a compromise position by the democratic process. And it was, and he was basically boxed in because of the checks and balances in the system. The judiciary, you had the legislative branch. He represented the executive branch, but he was unable to exert his dictatorial, let's say, exercise his dictatorial instincts initially. Um, it was an oppressive regime, but it was nevertheless functioning within, it was a conservative right-wing government, but functioning within the parameters, the constraints of the Constitution and the Democratic Republic. The Reichstag's fire, so he functioned like that for 4 weeks, but the Reichstag fire um, ended up giving him this opportunity to suspend a lot of the constitutional protections, exert his will, and then in March, basically 3 weeks later, he was able to get this enabling act through.
Now, are we going to discuss whether it's the belief of many people that he ordered the Reichstag burned? I don't know on which side of that debate you.
I what I'll say on this is there for the last, well, gosh, when did it burn? In February of 33, we're going on, more than 90 years now later. Endless archives have been opened, endless academic conferences, and to this day, no one can say definitively what happened. What they do know is, and I'll tell you what we do know, and then what the speculation is. There was a 23-year-old, 20-something Dutch communist who was caught in flagrante um, setting a fire in the Reichstag. He was eventually tried and executed for this. About took a year for the trial to be completed. But um, we weren't sure what his motivations were. There didn't seem to be any other connections to the Communist Party. So the communists clearly blamed the Nazis blamed the communists, but the communists and a lot of other people were blaming the Nazis because it fit so well into Hitler's plan or his plan. It helped him with his, bring forward his agenda. And what we do know is allegedly there was a tunnel connecting. Hermann Goering was president of the Reichstag and was the leading Nazi. I mean, we know him from the Luftwaffe, a close Hitler associate. There was a tunnel connecting his residence to the Reichstag, allegedly. The head of the Berlin Fire Department, who oversaw in situ the operation for extinguishing the blaze, saw a lot of suspicious evidence and signs that suggested to him that the Nazis were involved. He made this statement and ended up being removed from his position because of it, and got him out of the way. So it did play very well into Hitler's hands. We don't know to this day to what degree there was collusion or not. My personal belief is probably not. I mean, it came as much a surprise to Hitler. Hitler was actually having dinner with Joseph Goebbels when he gets this call, saying the Reichstag's on fire. And it's like, what are you talking about? Or is this a joke? Someone else said, boy, I hope it wasn't our boys who did this. This was another Nazi. So even the confusion within the Nazi party was such that, to my mind, suggests that this was just an opportunity that played into Hitler's hands. And, Ian Kershaw, who's one of the great Hitler biographers, said that, Hitler had the luck of the devil. And there were so many points in this man's life when his political career should have ended, even once he was, chancellor, once he was dictator, even during the war, there were so many moments when when things just broke for him in a lucky way. And anyway, so I think, my personal perspective is I don't think it was a communist plot. I think it was this renegade action by this man, that the Nazis and Hitler in particular knew how to exploit. And yeah, that's it. But frankly, surprisingly, we'll never know. And this is after looking at archives in Moscow, the confiscated archives that are at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. This is scholars who have been studying this for decades, and no one can say to this day definitively what happened there.
So let's move on to what I found very interesting in your article, to the extent that I understood it, is that Hitler was only given two cabinet, you'll explain what, and but how cleverly those two were used. So do you want to explain that?
Yeah. And this is just part of the thing when the New York Times says, Hitler's given up claim to be dictator. When Hitler's initial position was, I will only be chancellor. I will only accept the chancellorship if I'm given complete power and if I'm able to fill all the cabinet posts with Nazis. And this was his calculation that, 37% is 51 or 75% of 51%. So I get everything. And Hindenburg sent him marching and said no. Well, this had been in the summer of 1932. Hitler had a series of other meetings, possibly being offered the chancellorship, and the negotiations always collapsed on Hitler's demand for absolute power. Suddenly, what happened was there had been 5 elections that year that had basically cost the Nazi Party tens of millions of marks. So the party, by the end of 1932, was bankrupt. there were began to hemorrhage membership. He had reached 37% in the summer elections. There were elections again in November where he lost 2 million votes. People started leaving the Nazi Party.
Why did they do that?
Well, because Hitler had made certain
Um,
promises that he had not kept. Um, the other thing is that the German economy was starting to stabilize. They were bringing unemployment under control. A lot of Hitler's talking points were being addressed by the existing political system. So things were on the wane, so that frankly, when you read the newspapers in late December, early January of 1930, late 32, early 33, Hitler's all washed up. My favorite one is, and listen to this, it was one of the leading pundits of the day said, Hitler is a man with a great future behind him. Um, and he was basically, and Hitler recognized the fact that he was in trouble. So suddenly, when the chancellorship was offered him, instead of it's an all or nothing, he ended up with only 2 cabinet positions. And none of them, it was not for the military. He did not get foreign affairs. He did not get the economy. He did not get the military. He was given 2 posts. One was Secretary of the Interior, basically, went to one Nazi, and Hermann Goering, who we all know from Luftwaffe fame, was declared a minister without portfolio, so without a specific assignment. But the interesting thing about the position of Minister of the Interior is that you did control the press, you controlled electoral processes, um, and you you didn't control, and you controlled some internal security. And so what Hitler was able to do was to exploit those elements in order to begin to erode the democratic processes, beginning to curtail freedom of the press, um, begin to try to exert Nazi influence over the police and the security forces. Um, Begin trying to revamp the electoral processes to position them to favor Nazis in the future. So there was this attempt, but once again, at the same time, Hitler was constrained all along, um, until, for the first 4 weeks, and then the Reichstag fire comes and, he gets everything he wants because of the emergency decrees.
and that's when the beginning of the 6 million Jews and the millions of others, the path to that begins.
And it did. This is, and part of it is Hermann Goering, who was, the minister without portfolio. He said this in March of 33. He said, German Jewish citizens have the same rights as any other German. I mean, this was said by one of the key Nazis in the country. When you look at Hitler's anti-Semitic rhetoric, it had toned down. When you look at his speeches in the run-up to the elections, this was not a major talking point for him. It was the economy, the economy, the economy. And but they had this in their back pocket. What also happened was, even as the government was saying, you know, all Germans are equal, they had a 500,000 stormtroopers, the brown shirts, the guys with the brown shirts and the swastika armbands, were took their liberty of having Hitler as chancellor and were attacking Jewish businesses. They were attacking, Jews on the streets. I mean, this is the persecution began already with Hitler's appointment. It then gradually became systematized as time went on, and Phyllis, as you said, ended up, in the nightmare of the Holocaust.
I have a very basic question
Hmm.
that I've always wanted to ask someone. Who paid for the stormtroopers?
Um, this is this is two things. One is Hitler. I depends on what sources you read. I was just reading a newspaper from the time very recently, and the Nazis basically had all of this branded material. If you were a good Nazi, you had to buy a copy of Mein Kampf. If you were a stormtrooper, you actually had to buy the brown uniform and the swastika armband. So they use this to help fund the system, but the real money came from, and this was it had Hitler had run his movement for 12 years basically on tin cups, people standing on street corners, collecting pennies. The German industrialists wanted nothing to do with Hitler. He was this right-wing radical. He was offensive. On top of that, he was Austrian. He wasn't even German. So they kept their distance from him. But what we often forget is the Bolshevik threat. There was this thing, the idea of a communist revolution in Germany, and the fact was it did exist. Moscow was funding the Communist Party. There was a militarized part of the Communist Party. They would have wanted a communist revolution. There were 6 million communists in the country. It never came close to being a real threat, but it was a perceived threat because keep in mind, you'd had the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, a half a generation earlier. But the industrialists, fearing a communist threat, um, and because they were anti-labor unions, they started channeling money into Hitler in order to fund his movement as it began to falter. And this was buying some security. They believed that once they got Hitler into power, he would cool a lot of his more radical statements, and they would be able to temper him. The operative phrase at that time was, soup is always cooked hotter than it's eaten. Um, and so, it's this idea, once this guy's in power, once we put him in power, we can keep him constrained. He will serve business interests. And Hitler basically outsmarted all of them, one by one. They were compromised. But yeah, it basically, for the first 12 years, it was a hand-to-mouth existence for the Nazi Party. And it was only in the autumn of 1932, in the first weeks of 1933, that suddenly the industrialists started coming around Hitler in a significant way.
I see. So, so meanwhile, the stormtroopers have been uh, beating up people. For those fans of Downton Abbey, there was a subplot of, I forget which of the daughters, her lover went to Munich and disappeared. And after she, as I recall, hired detectives, they found out that he'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time and been beaten to death by some Nazi party believers. So
Yeah.
then we have to go to the fact that Dachau, which is near Munich, concentration camp, was opened in March of 33 before Hitler had even served a full 2 months as chancellor. And it was open for, in theory for political prisoners because at this point, after the Enabling Act, the historian will correct me if I get this wrong, Hitler had the right to outlaw his opponents, his political opponents, do whatever he wanted.
Well, actually, Phyllis, after the emergency decrees, this would have been on February 28th, the end of February. The emergency decrees were enacted. They started arresting the communists because, as I say, because of this perceived communist threat, the attack on the Reichstag. What happened was they were being put into jails, but the jails were filling up. And you were actually only able, they were arrested on something that was called protective custody, Schutzhaft, um, which was a legal gray zone where you were actually able to hold somebody for 24 hours without charges. Well, the Nazis were rounding these people up, handing them to the police. The jails were being filled. The police were saying, well, there's no legal basis for us to keep these people, started complaining. And what happened was the concentration camps were kind of they a release valve for the overcrowded jail system, the prison system there. So these camps were created initially for political prisoners. And I should say it was mostly communists and social democrats, but there were also, and this goes back to the local level, a lot of Jews were being targeted at that point and rounded up and taken without any basis at all and being put into the camps. And, there was a lot of brutality in the camps. There were a certain number of deaths, but eventually the system of the concentration camps ultimately ended up in what we know as the extermination camps. I knew this one wonderful Holocaust survivor, Max Mannheimer, who was a prisoner in Dachau, ended up living there and became president, I think, of the Association of Survivors, at least in the Bavaria area. But what Max used to say is that, the trail of blood that began at Dachau ended at Auschwitz. So yes, in March of 33, within 6 weeks of Hitler coming to power, 7 weeks, the systems were already in place that led, you know, to what we know as the Holocaust.
I would like to say one of the things I work hard is to explain gaps so that deniers and distorters can't deny and distort. Yes, in the early years, there were people who got out of, for example, Dachau. When my husband worked for such a person, he was a civilian boss in the army, and talking about the association that him just talked to. So when we were there from September 70 to May 72, Lucian Kempner, whose father, Robert Kempner, was a prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials. Anyway, he was on that committee that Tim just talked about. And what they worked to do, this is fascinating, 25 years after the end of World War II, was to get the beautiful trees in Dachau that it had been planted as seedlings removed from Dachau and placed outside so that visitors wouldn't think, oh, look how much beautiful shade they had. So that committee that you talked about was very
Yeah.
important. And I did want to mention for deniers, distorters, early on, there were legal ways, not escape ways of getting out of, for example, Dachau. No, we're not talking about Auschwitz. We're talking in the early years.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it was they would bring people in. Well, one way to compel especially Jewish citizens of Germany to leave, they would bring them into the camp. You'd have the abuse, then you'd be released after a month or 2 months. and then you'd say, I'm getting out of this country. And
And,
they would emigrate when they were allowed, then they were given a country to emigrate to.
and you
With
signed over your assets to the government.
exactly, yeah. And on top of that, so, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, yeah,
I should say my husband's boss was not Jewish, uh, but he was political, and that's why he was arrested. So
yeah.
let's mention, to move on a couple more weeks farther in the chronology, that on April 1st, there was the 1 day boycott of Jewish businesses. And I was interviewing someone who mentioned the broken glass windows. And I said, yes, but that was not the broken glass windows of Kristallnacht, which is November 9th, 10th, 1938. But this April 1st boycott of Jewish stores was pretty violent. And then the May 10th book burning all over Germany by university students, which now he's only been in power, what, February, March, April, and a few days in May. So his enabling act powers have been going very well for him, correct?
Well, and this is on the one hand, that's at that meta level of yes, with the government. These book burnings, the attacks on Jewish shops, on Jewish businesses, this was part of this deeper seated anti-Semitism among his millions of followers. The government didn't have to take a position on that or necessarily, you didn't need an enabling act. All you needed to do was to allow the signaling that things like this were permissible. And because you mentioned the book burnings, but also the attack on the Jewish shops, I will quote the famous Heinrich Heine quote, the great, 19th century German poet. Um, Wherever they burn books, sooner or later they will burn people.
And and if you see those pictures of the book burnings, they burned not just Jewish books by Jewish authors. They burned copies of okay, I just forgot the anti-war All Quiet on the Western
Oh,
Front
yeah, all quiet on the Western Front. Absolutely. Yeah, yeah,
because it
yeah.
was anti-war. They burned, I just saw a reference, maybe it was in your article or something else I was reading yesterday, blacklisted non-Jewish American authors like Ernest Hemingway. I mean, this
Yeah,
was
yeah, yeah. And this,
complete.
yeah. And this is the country of Beethoven and Bach and Goethe and Schiller that ended up in this nightmare world of, what we know as the Third Reich. Yeah. Um,
And I will just say for someone, anyone who wants to read, I know this will sound strange, a novel about this time that we're talking about, Leon Feuchtwanger's book, The Opermans. He was Feuchtwanger, Jewish German author, was lucky enough to be out of the country at this time. He did unfortunately go back to France, and then he was put in a camp. Then he had to be rescued in the United States. But he wrote about this almost as it says in real time. And the thing that absolutely stuck, because I read the book several years ago, although I highly recommend it, is that in this it's a novel, but in this elite high school, they suddenly stopped reading all those books and they read Nazi ideology. They stopped speaking Hochdeutsch, High German. Language went to hell, if I can say that. And how quickly, by changing the textbooks, oh, they got rid of all the humanities teachers and brought in Nazi teachers, and how quickly that change was done.
Since you're talking about other books, Phyllis, let me also mention a book by a man named Victor Klemperer. And a he was Jewish, married to an Aryan German, lived in Dresden, but started keeping a diary after Hitler was appointed chancellor on a day-by-day basis. His diary has been translated into English, but what I think is so powerful about this book is that you see these changes happening at an incremental level day by day. And I remember one of his entries from January of 1934. Okay, so this is Hitler's been in power a year. And he writes in his diary, how is it still possible that this man is still chancellor? That Hindenburg hasn't removed him. And what you also have to remember, when you read the newspapers from that time, it was he's doing such a bad job as chancellor. There's so much chaos in the country. Hindenburg is going to throw him out. And a lot of people were placing bets on how long it was going to be before, he was going to be tossed out on his ear.
And
Um,
why wasn't he tossed out on his ear?
mm, this is where maybe it's a good play to round this off. When I was writing my book Takeover, the hero of my book was Hindenburg, the president of the country. He'd been this great war hero. He was a monarchist at heart, but he had retired in 1914. When the war broke out, he went back in and became field marshal to serve his country. As soon as the war was over, he retired again, and was writing his memoirs. In 1925, the country was in crisis again. He ran for the president's position of this, although he was a monarchist, he did this for the sake of his country as he became president of the Weimar Republic and adhered to the Constitution, to the law. One person criticized him, says, Hindenburg follows the Constitution the way, a sergeant reads a field manual, on the front, meaning he adhered to all of the articles of the Constitution, and he really did uphold the Republic through an entire term. He was 84 when his term ended in 1932. He only ran for a second term to prevent Hitler from running for president. Hitler ran against him, and and Hindenburg just beat him by 6 million votes.
Mhm.
But for Hindenburg, a 7-year appointment, this was essentially a death sentence in office for the man. But he then said that summer, when he had the opportunity, when Hitler came and said, appoint me chancellor, I have my 37%. Hindenburg said, I would never, I would, you are so divisive. Your anti-Semitism, your divisiveness, he says, I could never appoint you as chancellor of our country for the sake of God, my conscience, and the country. And so he was completely against Hitler. He, by the end of within 6 months, we see him suddenly saying, okay, I will accommodate this man. And this is where I then begin to fault Hindenburg, because somehow he just I don't know if if he just got too old and tired, if he was being shielded from the excesses, but he's the one who ultimately let Hitler get away with what he did. And I think after the Reichstag fire, it was kind of all over. And at that point, you really do need to fault Hindenburg, because nothing would have prevented him from throwing the man out of office.
So the short answer also is if you read Timothy Rybeck's book, Takeover, Hitler's Final Rise to Power, you'll have more of this information that he's been so gracious to share with us. This has been such a wonderfully informative interview. I thank you so much, Tim, and I thank my listeners, and I hope you'll share this information. And to add on a serious note, I will say that for all those Jews, non-Jews, communists, everyone who were victims of Hitler and for the people who tried to save Jews and lost their lives in doing so, or didn't lose their lives, but lost their reputations because in their villages, I'm just reading a book now, people held it against them for years. May their memories be a blessing forever.